My name's Sarah Loughran and I am the Director of Radiation Research and Advice at the Australian Radiation Protection and Nuclear Safety Agency, also known as ARPANSA. And what we do at ARPANSA is we collaborate with other agencies such as Cancer Council Victoria to develop sun protection standards as well as raise awareness for sun protection more generally. So UV or ultraviolet is a type of radiation that comes from the sun. The sun emits 3 different types of radiation or energies. One of those is visible light, and that's what we see as sunlight. Another one is infrared radiation, and that's what we feel as heat from the sun. And the third one is ultraviolet radiation. And the difference with ultraviolet radiation is that we can't see it and we can't feel it. There are 3 different types of UV radiation: UVA, UVB, and UVC. And those 3 types of radiation are harmful in different ways. So UVA and UVB radiation are both known to contribute to skin damage, eye damage, and also can cause skin cancer. And UVC is actually the most harmful of the UV radiations. However, we don't get exposed to UVC because something in the atmosphere, which is known as ozone, blocks UVC from getting through to us down here on Earth. So a common mistake that people often make is that the UV or the level of UV is related to how hot it is, and that's actually not the case. They're different types of radiation. So for example, people can get sunburned on a cool, cloudy, overcast day because the UV index can still be high. And that's sometimes when it's more dangerous because we can often be less aware that the UV is still high, because if we're not seeing the sun, we think, oh, maybe it's okay. But actually the UV index can still be high even when it's not hot. We know that when the UV index is 3 and above, that this can cause damage to our skin. So what we need to do is when the UV index reaches 3 and above, we need to protect our skin. And there are 5 different ways in which we can protect ourselves. And you may have heard of those as being slip, slop, slap, seek, and slide. Slip refers to slipping on some sun protective clothing that covers as much of your body as possible, and this is one of the best ways that you can protect yourself from damage from the sun. We need to slop on some sunscreen, some SPF 50+ sunscreen to protect any areas of skin that aren't covered by our clothing. And we need to remember to apply this 20 minutes before we go outside into the sun, as well as to reapply regularly every 2 hours or more if we're doing water-based activities. We need to slap on a hat that has a broad brim or that covers the neck as well, a Legionnaire style hat, to make sure that we're covering our face and our ears and our neck as much as possible. We also need to seek some shade where possible. So whenever you can, find some shade under a tree or under a building where you can stay out of the sun. Also, we need to slide on some sunglasses to ensure that our eyes are also protected, because the sun doesn't only damage our skin, it can also damage our eyes. So in Australia, the UV index tends to be a little bit higher than it is in other countries, particularly countries in the Northern Hemisphere, like in England or North America. And there are a number of reasons why the UV index is higher in Australia. And some of those reasons include our distance to the sun and the equator, a little bit shorter than other countries. Also things like our atmosphere. So in Australia, we tend to have less smoke and dust and pollution in our air than a lot of other countries. And because we know that pollution absorbs some UV radiation, we know that when you have less pollution, while it's great for the air that we breathe, making it nice and clean, it also means that less UV radiation is absorbed and that we're exposed to more UV radiation. So those factors are things that contribute to the UV index being a little bit higher in Australia during summer than a lot of other countries. Another reason that the UV index is a little bit higher in Australia is the tilt of the Earth. So for summer in Australia, we're actually slightly closer to the sun than we would be in summer in Northern Hemisphere countries like in Europe or North America. It's really important that we're able to measure UV radiation because, as we've mentioned, you can't see it and you can't feel it. So ARPANSA has a network of sensors around Australia that measures UV radiation. And these sensors respond to the UV radiation and measure it in a similar way that our skin or our human skin would respond to UV radiation. And in order to derive the UV index, we use these measurements, and then we add in information about cloud cover and other environmental factors that we know can affect the UV index. And that's what gives us the number, and that's how we know when the UV index reaches 3 or above and that we need to protect ourselves from the sun. There are a number of ways that you can find out what the UV level is on any given day. One way is that on our website at ARPANSA, we display the UV index. We display the live values of what the UV index is right now. We also show predicted values that give the maximum of what the UV index will be on that day. Another really great way that you can know what the UV index is at your fingertips is to use the SunSmart Global UV app. So you can download this app to your phone, and at any time and in any location in Australia or around the world, you can see what the UV index is and know when you need to apply sun protection. SunSmart Global UV app also shows you the sun protection time. So it shows you for the location that you're in, the times of the day in which the UV is going to be 3 and above, and the times at which you need to protect yourself. Another great element of the app, which I love, is that you can also set up notifications. So you don't even need to open the app. It will just notify you when those times are going to be each day. So you don't even have to think about it anymore. You can just have the notification on the app remind you every day. It can be quite confusing knowing when you need to protect yourself, but what you need to remember is that when the UV index reaches 3 or above, then you must be applying sun protection measures. So it doesn't matter if it's 3 or if it's 5 or 6 or 10. At all of those times, you need to protect yourself from the sun. It's also a little bit confusing sometimes because people can mistake that when it's not hot, the UV index mustn't be high and we don't need to protect ourselves. And that's why tools like the SunSmart Global UV app are really useful, because on overcast, cloudy and cool days, we still often need to be protecting ourselves from the sun, and it can help remind you that even though it's not hot and it's not very nice outside, maybe you still need to be applying those sun protection measures. Another good way to remember when you need to be using sun protection in Victoria, if you don't have access to the SunSmart Global UV app or other websites or information that tell you what the UV index is going to be, is to remember that from about the middle of August until the end of April, the UV index on most days will reach 3 and above, and on those days you need to be applying sun protection measures. So a common question that we get asked is whether everybody needs to protect themselves from the sun and whether skin tone matters. And what we would say is that it doesn't matter what your skin tone is, you always need to be protecting yourself from the sun when the UV index reaches 3 and above. Even darker coloured skin tones can be damaged by UV radiation, and the other important consideration is that UV doesn't only damage our skin, it also damages our eyes. So it doesn't matter what colour skin you have, your eyes can also be damaged. So it's important to remember to protect yourself from the sun regardless of what your skin tone is. One thing that people sometimes get concerned about when they protect themselves from the sun is their levels of vitamin D. And we know that vitamin D is really important for our health. However, we also know that just small amounts of incidental exposure during the day, maybe walking from your car to your house or to the shops, is usually enough for most Australians to maintain adequate vitamin D levels. Research also shows that using sunscreen doesn't dramatically affect the production of vitamin D within your body. So it's very safe to use sunscreen and maintain your vitamin D levels. However, some people can sometimes be concerned about their vitamin D levels for different reasons, or they may have a family history of having vitamin D deficiency. And in those cases, we would recommend that you see your medical practitioner to investigate further if you do have concerns. So one thing that we know is that children's skin in particular is quite sensitive to UV radiation. So it's even more important that we ensure that children's skin is protected from the sun. So as a teacher or an educator, there are things that you can do to ensure that children are protected when they're enjoying the outdoors. You can ensure that they have sunscreen on before they go outside on all areas of skin that are exposed. make sure that they're wearing appropriate hats with broad brims that cover their face and eyes and ears. It's also important when children are playing outdoors that they have appropriate clothing on that cover as much of their skin as possible to ensure that they are protected from the sun. And clothing is one of the most important factors that we can provide to ensure that sun protection. So when the UV index is 1 to 2, that's considered to be low. When the UV index is 3 to 5, that's considered to be moderate, and from 3 onwards, we know we need to protect ourselves from the sun. If the UV index is 6 or 7, that's considered to be high. If the UV index is from 8 to 10, that's considered to be very high. And anything 11 or above is considered extreme. So the higher the number, the more quickly the sun is able to do damage to your skin, and that's important to remember. But what's also important to remember is that when the UV index reaches 3 and above, then you need to be applying sun protection measures regardless. Often aren't aware of is how often the UV index can reach the extreme level in Australia. And in the middle of summer, in those summer months, the UV index tends to reach the extreme level across the entire country, except for Tasmania and maybe some southern parts of Victoria, which are still reaching very high, so as high as 10. So it's important to remember that in the middle of the summer, regularly the UV index reaches these very high and extreme levels across the entire country. So one thing that we know is that while UV radiation can damage everybody's skin, we also know that children are particularly sensitive to UV radiation. In particular, children that are 12 months and below are very sensitive to UV radiation, and we recommend protective measures of clothing, hats, and staying out of the sun in shady areas for those children, and only applying sunscreen if there is any skin exposed to ensure that those very young infants are protected from the sun in those early years of life. It's also important for infants that are 12 months and below to ensure that you keep them out of direct sunlight when the UV index is 3 and above, because we know that when the UV index reaches 3, at that level skin damage can occur, and it can occur very quickly in young infants.